and we'll certainly send that along to the committee.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Mr. Strickland. Thank you, MP Zerowitz. And we're moving members to round 3 of our questions. And we've got the Conservatives up first. And welcome to our committee, MP Lawrence. You're up for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and it's an honor to obviously to ever appear at the Finance Committee. So I'm going to focus most of my questions on Mr. Lee here. So I just want to speak plainly about this and get his comments on some of the comments that I'm going to make. It's my belief that the more products we build, the more workers we have, the more services we deliver, the more prosperous we are as a nation. And you know what gets me excited? I certainly don't begrudge people who achieve financial freedom. That's great. But it's that economic growth, and that's what we call that. When we produce more products, we have more workers, that lifts millions of Canadians out of poverty. And so that's what gets me really excited. The challenge that I think we have is we're headed the opposite direction. I think we have a two-headed, or maybe, Mr. Lee, with a three-headed monster that the Canadian economy is facing right now. We have a deficit spending, which is leading, or at least in part, to inflation. Inflation means that for every dollar that someone earns, it's worth less. The other part is eventually that deficit spending has to be paid for. And at some point, you've got to pay the piper. And there's only 2 ways of doing that I'm aware of. And one is reducing spending, or you're increasing taxes. And what increasing taxes means that for all those workers who go out there every day, particularly those at the lower end of the economic spectrum, the less they get to keep. So they're going to get punished 2 ways with this continued reckless spending. One is every dollar they earn is going to be worth less, and then they're not even going to be able to keep as many of their dollars. And many experts have come before this very Finance Committee and said, you know what, when you add in the amount of clawbacks and withdrawals, in addition to the tax rates, people who are earning $50,000, $60,000 are actually facing effective tax rates of 40 or 50%. You add on to that inflation, it gets to a very scary place where we could see prolonged labor shortages and a lack of prosperity in Canada. Mr. Lee, would you comment on that? And if I'm incorrect, please correct me.
Sorry, Mr. Lee, you're on mute, Mr. Lee. Yep.
My apologies. I should know this. I use Zoom all the time. I'll be brief. The World Bank has done massive studies on this and poverty alleviation around the world. They have shown that competitive markets, productive markets, have removed over 1 billion people around the world, but I think it's 1.5 billion from the lowest levels of poverty. You look at the empirical evidence. There's no question that when you have a strong and vibrant economy, then it raises the standard of living for everyone, not just the people at the top. And so there's no doubt about that. I don't believe, and my views I don't think are any different from Don Drummond or David, the former governor of the Bank of Canada, and people, so-called blue liberals, if you want to call them that. Very quickly, to unpack one more point, I think it's very important, because you raised this point. Arthur Okun, the great liberal economist in the 60s, wrote a famous book called Equity versus Efficiency. And he said there's a constant balance in public policy in a mixed economy between, let's call it, policies of social justice versus policies of economic growth. And he said you got to strike the right balance. Because you need the growth to pay for the social justice policies. And I think that right now there's more of an imbalance. We focus so much on income redistribution, which is important. But at the same time, we've forgotten, or we're neglecting, and this is exactly what the former Liberal Deputy Prime Minister is saying, that we are not focused on policies of growth. We have domestic investment leaving our country.
Oh, thank you very much. Just a little bit further on that train. So one of the other things that can actually happen as well is that if we go the other way, if we start declining in economic growth instead of growing the economy, is that actually when that growth reduces, it actually reduces the amount of income for the government, because obviously it's a tax base. That's right. That's called the Laffer curve there. I was just wondering if maybe you could give us 30 seconds on that as well.
Well, I won't even, I understand the Laffer curve is controversial. I won't even use the Laffer curve. Governments federal, provincial, and municipal share in the growth. Because, I mean, you look at the revenues, the sensitivity in Western economies, and Canada's Exhibit A. That is to say, when the economy is growing, revenues gush. They just pour into the federal treasury, the provincial treasuries, and municipal governments. And then go look at the impact on the revenues flowing into governments when they fall off the cliff and they go into a recession. Their revenues just disappear. But governments are very sensitive to growth. The more governments grow, the more rapid the GDP growth rate in the economy, the more money flows into the treasury that can be then spent on healthcare, on social income support, and so forth. So there's anybody who believes in more social income support should be screamingly their support for economic growth, because it generates more money to spend on those policies.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. Thank you, MP Lawrence. And we are moving now to the Liberals and MP MacDonald for 5 minutes.